So last time we talked about Japan during the 1920s and 30s, and we went over how it was kind of a mess politically. You had all these different factions, many of whom were kind of overlapping. You had the Emperor is God crowd, you had the liberal Democrats, you had the people who wanted colonies, the people who wanted isolation, people who were pro UK and pro America, people who were pro Germany, people who wanted to attack Russia, people who wanted to attack China. You had all these different political groups that were struggling against each other. Now, by the time we get to around World War II, that is the late 30s and the early 40s, things have gotten a lot simpler. The Imperial Way faction got purged. The civilian government by this point in time has basically become irrelevant. And I suppose you could argue it basically becomes a junta once Tojo uh, is appointed prime minister. So a lot of the different factions kind of start to get knocked out of the way. And we also have, I won't cover it in this video, but you have all existing kind of political parties and political organizations merged into the Imperial Ruling Assistance Association, which becomes the single legal party. So you don't have quite the same amount of disunity that you had previously. Basically, by this point in time, there's three major players in Japanese society: the army, the navy, and the emperor. And kind of this transition to military government had greatly strengthened the Showa emperor's powers. Because kind of his main title and kind of his main kind of focus in government was as supreme commander of the military. And the book I'm going through, Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, makes it very clear that the Showa emperor was very, very deeply involved, particularly once the war started. He would have daily briefings from the various generals and chief of staffs. He would be deciding strategy. All chemical weapons and biological weapons had to be either directly or indirectly approved by him. The various kind of foreign policy things that led up to World War II were things that he had a final say about. As the war went on, he kind of took more and more authority over Japan's grand strategy. So, like I said, this kind of simplified things somewhat because you basically had all political authority vested in the emperor. Now, how effective this was is kind of another matter because you still had the army and navy, which often would do their own thing. As we covered last time, the Japanese military was kind of infamous for ignoring what Central Command ordered and just kind of doing their own thing to normally disastrous results. That being said, though, this concentration of power didn't really help that much in terms of setting some sort of overarching policy or goal for Japan. So, Japan, as we talked about last time, had gone into China. The general staff had promised the Showa emperor it's going to be done in like 8 weeks. China's going to collapse. We're going to get this done. And as I said, there was no war goal in China. There was no like way to define victory. The initial thing was we want China to reflect upon what it's done. Because when Japan was invading parts of China, some of the nationalist troops shot back, which was, by the Japanese logic, an act of aggression. So they wanted like to send China to their room and make them think about what they'd done. So the status quo, kind of by a couple years into the war, I mean, the Second Sino-Japanese War started in 1937, I guess, formally. So, kind of by 1940, they had taken a whole bunch of land, as you can see here, but it was basically a military stalemate. China was just too big. The Japanese didn't have the soldiers, even with the collaborationist troops, to occupy the country. The local population really had no desire to live under Japanese rule. And the nationalists could just keep retreating. Like they would retreat into the center of China and periodically rebuild. Now, by this point in time, and particularly by the end of the war, the nationalist war machine was a shadow of its former self, and they didn't really have anything beyond just kind of mass conscripted troops to throw at the Japanese. But the point is, there wasn't a real way to knock China out of the war. China was extremely decentralized and fragmented, and there was no group who was really powerful enough to seriously challenge the nationalists and Chiang Kai shek's regime. Mao, for his part, was still kind of contained by some of the nationalist armies, and he was playing the long game. He had no real desire to go out and fight the Japanese directly. So I believe for the majority of the war, the communists just kind of conducted low level harassment guerrilla attacks to make it look like they were doing something. And the Japanese had tried to set up their own like rival government, the reorganized national government of China, under Wang Jinwei, but that was like a joke. Like the Japanese didn't even really recognize their own fake government. Like it had virtually no control over any of the areas that it pretended to govern. Like not even as much as like Manchuria was a Japanese, basically part of Japan, but it was nominally a puppet state, and that was a lot more of a convincing puppet state than this one was. And the Japanese didn't even really bother to give them like weapons or support or anything. They just kind of declared it and said, this is the official government of China. Chiang's government is illegitimate because of reasons, etc. But like I said, unlike with Manchuria, where you can argue, okay, they restored the Manchu emperor and they had kind of saved Manchuria from being subsumed into Han China, which I guess is kind of what eventually happened. And it's a bit like the case with Tibet or something like that, where it is kind of culturally different. It's not always been part of China, yada, yada. But this setting up of like this fake puppet government that was like the lamest of the lame, like they didn't put any effort into it whatsoever, didn't convince anyone. So, kind of what I'm the long way round I'm kind of going about is Japan had no actual chance of victory in China. They had no definition of what victory in China would actually be. So the whole thing was just kind of a quagmire. Now, as bad as things were there was an upside to the war in China. The war in China had meant that Japan had to massively increase military spending. The army had swelled to many times its original size. There was new ships, airplanes, tanks. All this stuff was being built for the war in China. So it allowed Japan to build up a war economy kind of by creating the necessity for an army. Not just that, but they did control a substantial portion of China. And because they didn't really care about governing the areas they overran, they just looted everything that wasn't tied down. So you had this large portion of China, and Japan just looted all the natural resources, all the stockpiles, whatever they could tear down, and they could force the Chinese population to do slave labor to extract whatever else they needed. Also, keep in mind that they had fairly effective control over Manchuria, which was extremely resource rich. Manchuria has a lot of cattle, coal. Actually, it has a substantial amount of oil, which I hadn't even realized. It has oil, it has steel. It's an incredibly resource rich area, which is what Japan needed, because Japan had industry, but they didn't really have any raw materials on the Japanese islands. So all this new territory on the mainland was allowing them to just massively build up their military. So while the whole China debacle was going on, things were starting to move in Europe with the Axis Treaty, or I guess the Tripartite Pact as it was known, or the Anti-Comintern Pact, which the book doesn't really provide an exact reason for why Japan decided to enter into the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany. They made sure as part of the pact that they wouldn't get called in to attack the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union and Germany went to war. That they had specifically kind of set it up that way. So interestingly, Japan technically had a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, despite being at war with the U.S. So like what had happened was when Japan attacked America, Germany declared war on America in solidarity with Japan. But when Germany declared war on the Soviet Union, Japan didn't join in on that war. And the Soviets only entered the war in, I believe, 1945 when they overran Manchuria and North Korea. But that's a story for another time. So there was a bit of an ideological dimension to it. Now, Japanese politics, like I said, was very complicated, but there was a feeling that this might be the counterbalance. I think the emperor said something to the effect of there's only two systems in this world, totalitarianism and democracy, and totalitarianism is the stronger system and will win. And we have to ensure basically that right wing totalitarianism survives. So they saw it as the logical, I guess, kind of antithesis to both liberal democracy and communism. And they would join together to fight the evils of both communism and capitalism, third position, as it were. The other issue is Japan was very diplomatically isolated by this point in time. The war in China hadn't really won them any friends internationally, especially with how brutal it was going. And the lack of any kind of clear war objective just irritated a lot of people. Now, there's a lot of criticism on the pressure that America and the other, I guess you could say, European powers put on Japan, like cutting off natural resources, refusing to trade with them, embargoing them, that kind of thing. But ultimately, once you start to get into Japan moving towards the South Pacific when they occupied Indochina, the Americans felt that that area was it was they had economic and political interests in that area. It was a critical part of the global economy. They bought a lot of things from that part of the world. They couldn't allow it to fall under Japanese control. It would just completely change the geopolitical political economy of the planet. There's also the issue of the interest they had in the Philippines, which, because of where they are, I mean, look at them, they're exactly in the middle between Japan and the rest of Southeast Asia, were going to be taken kind of regardless. There's also the issue of the United States as a sovereign nation kind of has the right to trade with whoever they want to trade with. If they want to embargo oil to Japan, that's kind of their decision. If we're going to talk about nationalism and national independence and that kind of thing, America not wanting to provide indirect support for Japanese military action that went against their geopolitical interest kind of makes sense to me. There was also a lot of, and I know a lot of what the Allies did was cynical and for their own political gain, but at the same time, being democracies, they were a lot more susceptible to public opinion, and the media was much freer. So there was an aspect of the civilian populations of America and kind of the other allied countries that strongly disapproved of what Japan was doing in China and tried to kind of morally force their governments to deal with it. So this was kind of the situation Japan was going into in 1940. It was kind of the best of times, worst of times type scenario. On one hand, they had taken Taiwan and Korea and Manchuria and large portions of China. They had achieved what no Japanese government could have even dreamed of. They had truly like tripled the size of Japan. They had got it kind of all the resources other than I guess kind of oil that it would ever need. It had been this great success, but they were also embroiled in a war that wasn't going anywhere. There were fears that the Soviet Union could attack at any time, and America and the various Western powers had diplomatically isolated them and weren't selling them vital materials that they needed. So what you get now is you have kind of a collection of things that when brought together is kind of leading to disaster. So you have a country that has a very inflated opinion of itself, that believes that objective military strength, such as like the size of your economy and your industry and the number of soldiers you have and the amount of just equipment you have, is secondary to your will to win. That has a very poor track record of entering into wars with any kind of idea what the goals are, etc., just to kind of react to whatever's happening at a particular time. You have a moment where said country is particularly strong, but is constant is looks like it's going to decline going forward. And so the Japanese, I think what they thought was this is our only real chance to take down the Americans and the other Western powers, rather than trying to approach with them diplomatically and making some concessions. We're going to surge forward and just take absolutely everything. We are going to attack everyone. I like to think that like during the staff meeting, they're like, okay, here's the goal, your Majesty. We're going to attack everyone. We're going to attack the Dutch, the British, the Americans. We're going to launch some more offensive in China. We're going to invade everything we can. What about the war in China? It's nowhere near conclusion, and the majority of our army's tied up there. And then I could just picture like the chief of the general staff going, "With all due respect, Your Majesty, it is what it is. Nothing I can do, but I digress. Let's attack those other countries." So I think that was kind of the conclusion they came to. Like I said, I forget who it was, if it was Tojo or one of the other generals said to the Showa Emperor, "We are a sick patient, and we're going to die for certain if we don't go into this war. But if there's like a radical operation that has a 70% chance of success, you have to take that operation. You have to take that risk to ensure long-term survival." Now, did Japan have to attack everyone? I mean, there was a couple different things that they could have done. They could have tried to finish up the China War. I don't know how exactly, if that would just be limiting their occupation to like critical regions, trying to come to some kind of deal with Chang to maybe give up some of the coastal cities and some parts of kind of northeastern China as Japanese colonies, of just kind of withdrawing and giving up on it altogether. I mean, there's a lot of different ways they probably could have tried to end the war in China, and they probably should have tried to figure that one out before they went on the offensive against everybody else. Although, kind of paradoxically, the war in China was kind of the reason they launched an all-out offensive against everybody else, because that was kind of like I said, the reason why America was blockading them. Now, what I find really interesting is on the eve of their decision to attack the U.S. offered them a deal. See, just before this, they had come to an agreement with Vichy France to occupy Indochina, and the U.S. said, "Look, we're willing to normalize diplomatic relations. We'll lift the blockade. You just have to pull out of China." So the question is, what did America mean by China? Did they mean China proper? Did that include Manchuria? Did that include the coastal concessions, etc.? As far as we can determine, and as far as the author says, China just meant the Republic of China. It didn't include Manchuria, and I don't think it included Inner Mongolia and a couple of the other northeastern parts that Japan had occupied. Korea wasn't even mentioned in this, nor was Taiwan. From my understanding, those were just considered part of Japan. Colonies are just a direct kind of province of Japan. So I don't think there was any real talk or desire or like attempts to get Japan to leave the Korean Peninsula. But the foreign minister firstly didn't clarify this, even though the precedent beforehand was that no, Manchuria wasn't part of China, and that's what the U.S. was referring to. He told the emperor and the rest of the cabinet, "No, guys, by China they mean everything. We have to leave the continent altogether." So we kind of enter an interesting bit of historical speculation. So the emperor's justification and the cabinet's justification was they thought the Americans were lying, even if they entertained, let's say the Americans weren't including Korea and Manchuria and Taiwan within this concept of China, they could change their minds later. They could say, "No, we're doing this decolonization thing. You have to give up all your mainland possessions," etc. And that was kind of the justification. They said, "Look, America's going to do this either way. Let's attack them when we're strong and their kind of attention's divided between us and Germany." Like I said, an interesting piece of historical speculation is what if they had have accepted that deal and Manchuria and Korea had have remained basically part of Japan? That would have kind of been a fascinating change of affairs. Japan might have actually become a superpower as the home islands were industrialized by this point in time. They could colonize the various. Korea and Manchuria are pretty big, and they could begin to colonize and Japanize or Nipponize or whatever it would be those areas, and they could also start extracting natural resources there, and they could build up their navy further, and they might have been able to emerge from the war not only with their great power status intact, but to become the master of East Asia. Um, just having this portion of the map, like I said, achieves more than the wildest dreams of previous Japanese governments and what they had hoped to accomplish. Ultimately, though, they went for Operation Attack Everyone. And like I said, they came to the conclusion this is going to be the only chance we're going to get. We're going to get weaker over time from the blockades. We have a bigger navy than the US now. Everyone's distracted with Europe. If we can take enough territory, we can use the natural resources to build up the home islands and build up a bigger, better fleet. And if we can take enough strategic territory, that it'll make it very hard for the Americans to launch a counteroffensive against us. And that was kind of the logic that led them into World War II. So I'll probably do maybe one more video after this talking about the course of the war and what kind of happened. But I was just trying to kind of cover what was the actual logic. Not so much what were the ideological underpinnings, but what was kind of the political and military considerations that led to Japan's decision to enter the war. The Axis thing, from what I can determine, was kind of an afterthought. Germany and Italy were kind of an afterthought. It was just kind of like an attempt to throw themselves in with a new emerging power so they wouldn't be completely isolated globally. So, anyways, I hope that you found this interesting. Like I said, I'll do another video maybe about the course of the war. God bless you all. Hope you enjoyed the video.